Good evening. My name is Greg Sterling. I serve as the Dean of Yale Divinity School, and it is an honor to welcome you to this panel discussion. All of us are keenly aware that we face three major crises in our country right now. We face a global pandemic, which has killed to date 116,000 Americans. We face an economic challenge, which is another worldwide phenomenon as a result of trying to contain the pandemic. But we also face an enormous racial challenge. The challenge was set off when George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer on May 25th, a murder that many of us found absolutely appalling. That set off an enormous reaction, not only in our country, but globally. The reaction was set off for different reasons, but certainly one of the key reasons is that this is not the first, but rather another example in a very long list of people who have been brutalized by those who are sworn to protect and defend us. I'm going to mention only the cases that have received national prominence since 2000 as a way of helping us to understand just how problematic this issue is. Ronald Madison, who is mentally disabled, and James Brissett, who was 17, were shot and killed by police on September 4th in New Orleans. Sean Bell was shot the day before his wedding on November 25th in 2006 in Queens, the borough of Queens in New York. Oscar Grant was shot in the back while lying face down on a BART station platform in Oakland on January 1st, 2009. Kelly Thomas, a mentally disabled homeless man, was beaten by Fullerton, California police for looking into cars and died 5 days later on July 5th, 2011. Eric Garner died after he was held in a chokehold for allegedly selling cigarettes illegally in New York City. This occurred on July 17th, 2014. Michael Brown was shot following a struggle, even though he was unarmed, by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9th, 2014, a shooting which set off and helped to bring into existence the Black Lives Matter movement. Walter Scott, in a video that I just can't get out of my mind, was stopped for a broken taillight in North Charleston, South Carolina, and shot in the back when he fled on April 4th, 2015. Freddie Gray was arrested for having a knife in his pocket and beaten so badly in a transport van by Baltimore police that he died in custody. This was in April 2015. Laquan McDonald, October 20th, 2014, armed with a 3-inch knife and at least 10 feet from any human being, didn't drop his knife when he was ordered to do so and was shot 16 times. Sandra Bland was pulled over on July 10th, 2015 on a pretextual traffic stop and was arrested when the exchange became heated and died in her jail cell 3 days later. Philando Castile, July 6, 2016, shot during a traffic stop when he reached for his ID in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. Terrence Crutcher, September 16th, Tulsa, Oklahoma police and shot and killed him after his car was found abandoned in the middle of the road and he reached inside the car with the police present. Antoine Rose II died on June 19th, 2018. He was an unarmed 17-year-old who'd been a passenger in a car that was stopped because it matched the rough description of a car reportedly involved in an earlier shooting. Rose bolted from the car and was shot and killed after being hit 3 times. O'Shea Terry, September 1st, 2018, in Arlington, Texas, was pulled over for an expired temporary tag. And when he tried to drive away, the police shot into the car and killed him. Breonna Taylor, March 13th of this year, in Louisville, Kentucky, was shot when police used a no-knock warrant, broke into her home, and her boyfriend, not knowing what was happening, with a licensed firearm, shot at the police, not knowing who they were. They returned fire and killed Miss Taylor. We know about George Floyd, and it seems unbelievable that after George Floyd, we could have others, but already Rayshard Brooks was killed last Friday night in Atlanta after an exchange with police when he had a taser in his hand and fled and was shot and killed outside of a Wendy's drive-through. What do we say and how do we respond to this litany? These are only the cases that have received national attention. There are many, many more, I'm certain, we're all certain, that haven't been caught on somebody's camera and haven't had witnesses to document. I think it's important that the faculty at a divinity school have a voice in the national conversation. We need a moral voice to be heard in this. And so we put this panel together, From Words to Work, Dismantling Racism. We are deliberately focusing on the issues facing us in America. They face other contexts as well. We're not focusing primarily on Yale Divinity School in this panel. It was intended to have a national focus, which isn't to say that Yale Divinity School should get a pass on problems within it. It's just that's not the particular focus of this panel. We have 4 members of our faculty with us who've agreed to address questions that we will pose and that a good number of readers have sent in. They are taking them in alphabetical order. Harry Attridge, who, after a very storied career as a New Testament professor and a professor of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, is stepping down at the end of this month officially, but who's famous for his work on Hebrews and the 4th Gospel in particular, and was dean of Yale Divinity School from 2002 to 2012. Anthea Butler, who's actually technically on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania in the departments of Religious Studies and Africana Studies, but who spent the year with us as a Yale University Presidential Fellow, completing a manuscript entitled Reading Race, Hope, Religion, Education, and Interracial Cooperation. She is one of the go-to persons when media are looking for someone to comment with expertise on matters of race, religion, and politics. Our third panelist is Willie Jennings, who is a specialist in systematic theology and Africana studies. He's best known for his award-winning book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. The book won the two of the most prestigious awards in North America. Willie, like Anthea, is also someone who is drawn upon both nationally and internationally as a commentator on matters that deal with race, religion, and politics. And finally, our 4th panelist is Laura Nasrallah, who is a specialist in the New Testament and material culture. Her most recent book, Archaeology and the Letters of Paul, includes an analysis of slavery in the Roman Empire. And one of the courses she will be teaching this fall at the Divinity School includes an entire section on slavery. Laura was a faculty member at Harvard Divinity School from 2003 to 2019 and joined us a year ago here at Yale. And we're absolutely thrilled to have her with us and incredibly pleased that she could join us on this panel. So the format of the panel is as follows. I will pose a question and I'll ask one of the panelists to respond to the question. And then we'll let any of the other panelists join in as they wish. We'll do that through one round, and then we have compiled a series of questions that you, the viewers, have sent in, and we'll go through the same process a second time, posing 4 questions, and I'll ask each of the panelists to respond to one of those questions and let the others join in as they see fit. Obviously, in the second part, we received far more than 4 questions, so I apologize if your question wasn't selected, but we're going to try to roll some together and hopefully include as many as we can. So let's begin. The national and international eruption over the murder of George Floyd reflect this problem that we've just chronicled in the introduction. How do we change the policies of policing that have led to what is undeniable evidence of racial bias and the use of deadly force without justified means in our country? Can we address police brutality in isolation, or do other issues need to be included? So Anthea, I know you've been asked to address this many times, but I'm going to start with you. How do you address that?
I think the way we address it, Greg, is to first realize that the talk about funding the police and training and all of that isn't working. The most recent killing in Atlanta this past weekend, the police officer in question who shot the gentleman basically just had training about how to use a firearm and also non-escalation training twice this year. So we already know that the things that we've tried to put in the past aren't working. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to kind of deal with the litany that you started out with, because I think that is crucial. That is a litany of shame. It is a litany of violence. It is a litany of pain. And that litany says that the problem of racism has not been dealt with in America. As a matter of fact, it's gotten worse because of certain elements in our country where people have excavated these wounds. They have not been healed. And so if we're going to talk about policing, I think the first thing we have to do is to realize that even though we know that policemen have a very horrible job in some ways and have sworn to serve and protect, that police are not immune from being racist. And I think that is very clear from what we can see in all of these shootings and the violence. That's first. The second is that we have to start to think about the amounts of money and the amount of weaponry that we've put into police forces. I think this is a really crucial problem where police got weaponized right after the end of the 90s into the 2000s. I can tell you that a couple of weeks ago when everything broke out here in Philadelphia, I had a tank 5 blocks from my house. And that tank shot flash bombs and tear gas, and I had 2 helicopters over my house. That's a lot of firepower. And this is America. And then there was a call to bring out the military. And I'm like, the police are already the military. We don't need the military. So I question the amounts of money that are being put in. I think this talk about defunding the police, you have to really pay attention to what is being said. The monies that we've given to some of the police forces could be diverted to use for things in the community that have been defunded, like summer programs, education, all of these things. But I do think the biggest issue right now we have is the issue of this country not being able to deal with racism. How do we talk about that? How do people begin to explore their implicit biases, like what happened in Central Park? the same day that George Floyd was killed, which kind of really kicked off everything in a way. And that is a microcosm. I don't think we can solve it within this conversation, but I do think that we have to start to look at these elements of too much money, militarization, racism, and finally, and I think most importantly, the police fraternities and fraternal orders. These are the people who rev up everything and protect their members, as they should. But if we're talking about union busting, some of these police unions have a lot of power and a lot of authority, and they are able to protect their members and to make sure that those kinds of infractions that they do, whether they are infractions that don't result in violence or infractions that do result in violence and murder, they have protections that they should not have. And I think this is where we begin to think about all of the components that come together. But the bottom line, the foundational problem is racism in America.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to those comments? I found it interesting that since we live next door to New York City, that the mayor of New York City found out, he was pointed out, has added $1 billion per annum to New York City PD since being mayor. That's a huge increment. And one of the suggestions that you're making, which certainly resonates with me, is the idea of moving some of that funding to social services, which sometimes police end up trying to fulfill anyway because the social services are gone.
Yeah.
And you don't need somebody with a gun on their hip to address those issues.
Exactly. Let's take the case of domestic violence, for instance. A lot of times what happens in domestic violence incidents is that when the police come out, that escalates, and we've had policemen being shot, we've had members of that household, whoever's perpetrating that violence against others in the household, shoot the whole household and kill them. There needs to be ways to think about de-escalation, and how do you have another kind of policing, or maybe even not policing, but community activity to help people who are mentally ill, for instance. There have been mentally ill people who didn't need to be treated the way they were, who were shot and killed. And if you had a person who was prepared and trained to deal with the mentally ill, instead of a policeman who comes out and does aggressive violence, that person might live. And so I think if we start to think about where funding can go to help support some of the things that the police does, right? But not to have police directly involved with that, to have them send that call to someone who can deal with that. That helps to de-escalate things. That helps to bring some sense into the community that people who are involved in the community are involved in everyday lives there, and not people who are living out in the burbs somewhere and coming in and thinking that everybody who's living in the city is an animal.
Yeah. Well,
I'd just like to add, if I may, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think the move to so-called defund the police, which I think is a misnomer, it's really refunding our whole social service organization. I think that's important. I think we also need to have mechanisms in place to hold police responsible for the norms that we think that they should observe. And I think one of the things that we've seen in many of these cases is a reluctance on the part of local prosecution teams to go after the police for what are clearly egregious misuses of their power. And that is in part due, I think, to the intimate relationship between police and local prosecutors. And having statewide or national norms that are going to be enforced by people other than in the local system, I think is a way of holding police responsible. We're always going to have police, and I think we're always going to have them engaged in some sort of activities that push the barriers of civil discourse and comity. And we need to have norms that obtain in those sort of situations, and we need to have some sort of mechanism for holding them responsible. And we just don't have it.
So let me ask just one quick question. What about civil review boards? Those have typically not been very effective in trying to corral these problems, but a number of communities tried that. You're suggesting national.
State or national, yes, just relying on local. Look at the situation in Georgia, where Ahmaud Fabry was shot down by a couple of folk who chased him, lynched him in effect. And the local prosecutors did not want to go after them. Why? Because one of those guys had worked for the police for some time, and they all knew one another. Now, both state and federal people have gotten involved, but only after enormous pushback. I think we need to have some mechanisms in place to hold people responsible for the norms that we think that they should observe.
Willie, I'm going to ask you to respond to this next question. When I saw the video clip of George Floyd as he was suffocated by the knee of a police officer, I became enraged. I felt that I was one of the people, or I wanted to be one of the people standing on the sidewalk yelling at the police, get off and get off and get away. It simply enraged me. You've thought a good bit about the role of anger theologically. What are the proper and improper means of expressing anger from a moral and theological perspective?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for putting this panel together. Always great to be with my colleagues. The feeling of anger is understandable. Rage is probably the more precise term we need to be thinking about in relationship to what you just said, and in relationship to what so many people feel. It's the arrogance that comes with this violence, the privilege of being able to do this violence, which heightens the rage so many people feel. When I watched it, like so many others, something broke in me, because it was yet another moment in which the privilege of violence tied to police, tied to white men in uniform, comes home to you. And so I think anger is not only appropriate, but anger and rage are necessary at this moment. One of the difficulties we have faced in this country is that Black rage and Black anger have always drawn tremendous fear. People have been terrified of the anger of Black people. And even many Black people have been terrified of their own anger. And for good reason, because for so many Black people, their anger only begets violence placed upon their own bodies. And so the struggle has always been how to handle anger, how to manage it. The problem is that managing anger, especially in this moment, can be more problematic than the anger itself. That is to say, it could be more damaging than the poor use of that anger. I am encouraging everybody to be angry right now and to find a way to see the anger as a shared project that binds us to God's righteous indignation. The challenge is not to let anger move into hatred. And that's always the difficult thing, to be angry but not to hate. Because once we enter hatred, then we open ourselves up to violence. Of course, hatred and violence have been part of the common currency of this country from its very beginning. And one of the disciplines that's always been inside of Christianity, especially the Christianity practiced by most people of color, most African Americans, is a discipline in which we live with anger, but we fight against hatred, and we shun as best we can violence. Now, of course, in this country, we understand that violence is, as I said, a part of the currency of the way things function. And so the challenge always is how can we walk away from, that currency and its power in getting things done. As many historians have said, one of the things about the civil rights movement, one of the leverages, one of the points of leverage of the civil rights movement is that King and others said, if you don't deal with me, if you don't deal with us, you'll have to deal with them. That is, you have to deal with Black folks who are not only angry, but they have weapons. And it's toying with that fear that always shadowed the civil rights movement, and it shadows so much now. My worry is that many people are being driven not by a righteous indignation, an anger tied to a righteous indignation, but they're being driven by fear. And that is, they want to do something because they're afraid of what might happen in their communities if they don't do something, and or they're afraid of being seen as racist. And those 2 points of motivation are not going to sustain us in this moment. We have to have an anger that ties directly to hope. As I like to say, anger is the engine of hope now. And we need that at this current moment.
So let me ask this, Willie. I mean, I had great admiration for Martin Luther King Jr. and for what he was able to accomplish in his life. And he followed somebody else, or had as a precedent somebody else I have admiration for, Mahatma Gandhi, who did something with nonviolence in India. Does the current generation of leadership in this movement look upon King as being antiquated, and that this hasn't worked, and here we are in 2020 still addressing major racial problems, and so we can't follow that model? Or is that model still viable for many?
I think so many activists today, it's not a question of King's methodologies being antiquated. The real question is the stubbornness of racism and the impenetrability of white ignorance. And I think that's for so many 20-somethings and 30-somethings. What I hear in their frustration is the stubbornness of this and the refusal of people to recognize the irrationality of their reasoned arguments for why we are where we are. I at this point, I don't think there's anything we can do to convince the young generation of activists that things are going to get better unless they see concrete change. And I completely agree with them, because at this point, as Anthea was saying earlier, this is not about adjusting certain policies. This is not about increased education of police. This is about a fundamental change that's necessary. And I think they are right to see the deep lines of connection. We are yet in certain practices that go right back to slavery. We know that. And we're in the midst of those practices and certain structural realities that go right back to slavery. And they're wise enough to see these deep connections. And so their impatience is not an impatience with a particular methodology. Their impatience is over, and the way I would put it, their impatience is over what is clearly an ongoing energy, an ongoing power that sustains the status quo. As you've heard me say before in other contexts, I mean, in our country, so much of structural racist violence is built right into the way communities are shaped, right? They're built right into the way neighborhoods are shaped. And, especially for young people, they feel that. You feel that when you grow up in a community where it's a food desert or it's a hospital desert, and, the educational system is what it is. You understand that this is not by chance, that it takes incredible energy and imagination to shape these communities in these ways. And so their impatience I think is with these ongoing energies that constantly press forward the white supremacy of this country.
All right, well, that leads me to the next question. And that is when we think about racism, it's oftentimes thought of as something that um, African Americans and Latinx people need to call to our attention, meaning whites' attention. And it seems that too often the issue is put on their shoulders, whereas in reality, the racism we face is a white problem. Whites, and I'm white, are the ones who enslaved Africans. Whites are the ones who passed and enforced Jim Crow laws. And whites are the ones that created the new Jim Crow and the penal system and created the structure of a society that does benefit us in ways that are not fair to many others. So, how do we make this a white problem? That is, how do those of us who are white understand we're the ones who need to wrestle with this? We're the ones who have a real problem. And so on this panel, we have 2 African Americans, 2 Caucasians, and that was quite deliberate because I think we have to wrestle with this. So Harry, uh, how do you think we can do
In 10 words or less, right?
that?
Having a panel like this, I think, is one way to do it. That is to have conversations, serious conversations about what our problems are and how we address them. In some ways, I think that white America has long recognized that racism is a problem that they have to solve, but they had a naive view of what the problem was and how it could be solved. You go back to the 60s and the changes that were made there, the Voting Rights Act and the like, I think were welcomed by a lot of people as solving the problem. And then you see that carried through in attitudes like that of our Chief Justice, who wrote the opinion on eliminating government supervision of voting rights issues. Why? Because the law had been passed and the problem was solved. I think people were unaware of some of the things that Anthea and Willie have been talking about, the structural issues that undergird our racist systems. I think the explosion of the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months has opened up new possibilities. And I think these possibilities have to be pursued at 2 levels. One is the individual level and the other is the social level. On the individual level, the situation that Anthea mentioned a little bit ago, the Central Park confrontation between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper revealed a lot of things about whites and our attitudes toward race. She did not think she was a racist. She assumed a lot of things that are racist. There's a lovely little piece, a heart-wrenching little piece in the National Catholic Reporter by a fellow who's on the faculty of Fordham University, Brian Massingale, an African-American Jesuit, analyzing that situation and all of the things that this woman assumed about how her situation was going to be read by police, by anyone who would hear her narrative, and how in reading it that way, Christian Cooper would be put in a corner. Fortunately, he knew enough and had a plan to deal with that, and he had it all on tape. And the fact that we have seen that and seen it time and again has revealed to us the way in which certain kinds of assumptions that we all make work in our lives. And I think one of the things that we are going to have to do is to think about what we assume about ourselves, about others, about the situations that we're in, about police and the like. We can help ourselves to become a little more woke on all of these matters. But then there's the institutional front, and Willie has already addressed that, I think, in a major way. There are inequities of housing, of educational opportunities. There are things built into the system that, again, we kind of assume and don't worry about an awful lot. We're going to have to start worrying about them in a major way. And some form of reparation, I think, is probably in our future. And how exactly that's going to be organized and orchestrated, I think, is a challenge for the next generation. But these issues, structural social issues of housing, of education, of opportunity and the like, I think are going to have to be addressed in some sort of systematic way. And we're all going to have to do it together. So we need to raise awareness, and we do address these issues. I think the fact that we have so much attention to them now is encouraging in a way. I think something might result from all of this. I certainly hope so.
So, Anthea or Willie, do you want to respond in any way, to what Harry's just said?
Yeah, I'd like to. I agree with Harry, but I would go further. One of the things I would say is that for many white people right now, that fear is what drives them to keep all the structures in place. Fear is what's driving everything. There was one African-American woman in a video that said, just think if Black people weren't like this, what would be happening right now if the lid was off of everything? And I think that's the fear, that the lid comes off of everything. But, as I like to tell people, we're here now. And we're here in part because there has been no recognition. As long as you do well under a system that benefits you, you have no reason to change that system, right? And so all of the things that are happening in the streets, whether that's, burnings and, looting and the things that are even happening right now where I'm at in Philadelphia, people said this is horrible, but it also started people on change. And it seems like in this country, unfortunately, that things have to go into fire and blood before anybody pays attention to anything. And that's horrible. And right now we have to change that pattern of behavior. But that's the responsibility of white people. One of the things, if I say nothing else on this, I want to say this very loudly and clearly. You cannot keep coming to Black people who are already wounded under the system and expect us to change it. It has been wounding to see so many Black people continue to die. Every summer I get ready to try to do work, and I can't do that work because basically what happens is there's a shooting, something happens, and we get into this Sturm und Drang. The woundedness of African Americans and people who have suffered under racism in this country is staggering. And I think until white people begin to understand the depth of that pain and what has been done to us through 400 years of just living under this mess, then we can start to talk about what the healing can be. But I think I need white people to understand what this takes out of us and what you lose, because you lose something because we don't get to be everything that we could be because of the racism. And that's the troubling part about all of this.
That's a crucial point, what Anthea just made. I mean, the burden of carrying the thinking and the feeling of this as a constant companion is a very weighty matter. But I also think, along with what she had just said, we're at a crucial moment in which so many people now are being invited to think seriously about whiteness. I mean, there have been so much study and so many studies on the very character of whiteness, that whiteness is not a biological fact. It is a way of being in the world. And it's time now for so many people who've been shaped inside whiteness as a way of being in the world, a preferred way of being in the world, to start to think about what it means. And I think especially for people of faith, our lives of faith should discipline us away from the idolatry of wanting to be white as a way of being in the world. Very, very much like in the time of Jesus, those who wanted to become Roman citizens, wanted to have the definition of being a Roman citizen. What does it mean to walk away from that, or to see a space between that preferred identity and being a Christian? And in this country especially, whiteness has been the achievement of so many immigrant groups and continues to be an achievement. And so, as Anthea was saying earlier, for so many people, why they would push back at what we're talking about is that they are a part of a legacy that they're proud of having become white. They're proud of what whiteness means. They are proud of what they think whiteness will promise them for the future. And to challenge it is to place them in an unknown future that does not promise the benefits that their parents have received and their grandparents. We have to always remember it has been good in this country to be white. It's been a great thing for so many people. And for so many people, they're not going to give that up. They are going to be very defensive about what we're talking about, because from their perspective, what we're asking them to walk away from is precisely what their immigrant ancestors died to obtain.
Well, my hope, and I say this as a Christian and a dean of a divinity school, is that our moral sensibilities as Christians will help us move past that and move to a more just society than what we have right now, because we certainly don't have one right now.
Could I make one little suggestion? I agree with everything that's been said. There's a resource, I think, that's in our scriptural text that I think can be used and be helpful for Christians who are trying to address this issue and trying to question their presuppositions and become more aware of the situation of which we all are a part. And that's the little story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman, someone whom Jesus denigrates as a dog until she pulls the rug out from under him and convinces him to do what is right. I think we can learn from the fact that Jesus learned about relations with people outside of his own orbit and people whom he would have naturally judged negatively, to question our own presuppositions and our own attitudes toward race and ethnic divisions in our society.
Thank you, Harry. No, I think you're right. Let me move the conversation again. When we think about police brutality, most of us, at least I think, principally of the violence done to males. And in the litany that I gave, most were males, but there were 2 women's names in that litany. And women have not at all been exempt from this whole struggle and from suffering under racial prejudice. But Laura, the question I'd like for us now to think about for a few minutes is African American women in particular have had 2 battles simultaneously. They've not only suffered from racial discrimination, but they've also suffered from patriarchy, which is true for women in general in our society. But are those 2, in their case, inextricably bound? Can they be separated and dealt with individually? Can you say something about this from your perspective as somebody who's worried about this in the ancient world and in the modern world?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for that question. And thank you all for allowing me to be on a panel with respected colleagues. And I think it's so important for those of us who are at historically white universities to address these questions, to think about them in terms of our own settings, as well as our national setting, because as folk who are in education, we are in the business of trying to train citizens, trying to be in the service of our nation and of the world. So I guess this is a great place for us to start. To your question, it makes me think about the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who in 1993 wrote a really important article called Mapping the Margins in the Stanford Law Review, where she talked about intersectionality. And it's now a word that a lot of us use. She was really emphasizing the ways in which race, status, economics, gender all are various vectors along which lines of domination, oppression, and lines of coalition can occur. But I think that talking about patriarchy, it's in some ways more important to talk about the ways in which white women have continued to oppress Black women over time as they have thought about how to deal with patriarchal systems in the US. So you talked about history and you talked about the ancient world and the modern. So my mind goes to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who in the 1890s was working on the Woman's Bible. It's a really revolutionary idea of having women as commentators on the Bible, producing this text. But at the same time that she was doing that, she was arguing for women's suffrage, but for white women's suffrage, and really against Black suffrage. I think also about the ways in which various of our colleagues have really taught us about the ways in which the story of Sarah and Hagar is a kind of template for white women's oppression of Black women. I'm thinking back to Renita Weems' I think it's called Just a Sister Away. Also the ways in which Dolores Williams really insisted that we see that story of Hagar sent into the wilderness by a wife, the acknowledged wife, sent to die with her child as a moment of reckoning for white women to think about the ways in which they have engaged in the oppression of Black women, and for Christian people as a whole to think about the ways in which they have held up atonement and suffering as central to the Christian experience, instead of focusing on Hagar, on life, on finding a way in the desert, on a ministerial vision for life. I think about the more recent work of Nyasha Jr. on Hagar, and I think about Shively Smith comparing the life of Assata Shakur to the story of Sarah and Hagar. I also really want to point back to Black Lives Matter and its origins as a way to think about patriarchy and coalition. So Black Lives Matter, as everybody knows, was founded by three women, and by three women, Opal Tometi and Patrice Khan-Coulors and Alicia Garza, who really emphasized not one model of leadership, not one leader alone, but the ways in which we can form coalition, right? Their leadership happened in community, and they challenged people to form grassroots community as well. So not one, perhaps male leader, but instead a community of leaders who are committed to Black Lives Matter, first of all, also to issues of immigration, also issues of the ways in which queer folk need to be included in this conversation, also the ways in which we need to think about justice for workers. So to me, that's a real model and a way to shift our conversation to thinking about the complicity of white women in anti-Blackness, and also the ways in which we can imagine different formats of leadership and transformation that are not only by one person, but really happen at the level of community.
Thank you. Anthea, I would be wrong if I didn't ask you if you would like to say something about this.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. I think that all of these things together are a real sense of Black women not being paid attention to. And I think I want to take it one step further as a historian and to think about the ways in which African-American women have always been asked to uphold African-American men. And that has been a very big part of all of this, so that the work of Black women in the midst of now with Black Lives Matter, or any of these incidences, if I think back to Emmett Till, for instance, it's Emmett Till's mother who says, open the casket, be the person who, I want you to see what they did to my son, right? I think about all of the mothers, Sabina Filton, Eric Gardner's mother and his sister who's dead, right? All of these women who have had to work against the violence, and that takes a toll on them too. But it's also important to recognize the role of African-American women in pushing back against racism, to try to work through these things, whether that's with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and wanting to get the vote and having to fight against white women because they don't want them to be part of the suffrage movement, or to think about the ways in which African-American women had to fight to be part of the temperance movement. They didn't want them to be a part of it. They did not, they denigrated them all the time. And so I think that, just like Zora Neale Hurston said, Black women are the mules of the world. We also are the mules who are trying to help this racial thing go forward. And I think that if we can think about what is happening in this particular moment and the ways in which Sandra Brand or Brittany Brianna, who is the woman who got shot and killed in Kentucky, the ways in which that takes a toll on Black women, it's a whole nother ballgame. And I think that we really have to look towards how we care for African American women during this time period, because they have been really wounded too. And that force of having to take care of everything and everybody is really something else. And I could speak for this personally and say that it's too much. It's really quite too much. And if my white sisters don't come on board, I don't know what we're gonna do. I mean, there's a lot of resentment for us when we have to carry all of this and see white women go off on their daily, go to yoga, do everything else and be happy. And we're not. I'm just gonna be honest, this is being real.
Thank you. Let me move, because we need to, for the sake of time, to some of the questions submitted by some of the viewers. And I'm gonna try to collapse some of them into single questions, multiple questions. So Willie, I'm going to give you the first one. And the question is, there are many people appealing to God in the midst of this crisis. Both liberal Christians and conservative Christians, as they're typically divided.
Mm-hmm.
Where is God in this, and what should we expect? How should we be thinking about God in the midst of this huge crisis?
Well, if we're focused primarily on the racial condition of the West, and we're asking the question, where is God? Then the answer that most of the people I know have often given to that question is that God is right here with this knee on God's neck. God is right here with the gun pointed at God's head. God is the one. God is the one suffering, and God is the one who is with those who suffer. Of course, the difficulty with the question, Greg, is that it presupposes an idea of power. Where is God? In many ways can be translated into, where is God's power at right now? And why isn't that power being used? And the difficulty for Christians in this country, especially Christians in the West, but especially in this country, is that we don't have the theological sensibility to know how to even think divine power, because we exist inside worldly power. To live in this country is already to live inside a profound, distorted vision of power. And to then function as a Christian inside that distorted vision of power. So it's very dangerous for Christians in this country to talk about God's power. Because if we were theologically attuned, then we would recognize that God's power has nothing to do with our life in this country. There's another power that's driving that. And it's most often captured by the word demonic power. And so I think for so many Christians now, especially in this country, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how is it that we can be Christian? How can we be followers of the God we worship in this crucial moment? Because the Christianity of America has been a Christianity deeply at home with the violence of America. And that reality means that if we think about God's presence here, what God would be doing is casting out the demon out of us. That would be the reality of divine power for us right now. God exorcising from us the demonic.
All right, thank you. Laura, I want to come back to you and ask about an intersectional question. So we're in these three crises together, and the health crisis has also created a good deal of bias against Asians and Asian Americans. And so how will Asians and Asian Americans, how should they think about this crisis? And the questioner asked this specifically: what's the role of, quote, model minority in anti-Black racism? And how do we respond to that theologically?
I guess I would shift the question and I would ask, how is it that white supremacy creates a model minority? How does it create good immigrants and bad immigrants? How does it split coalitions between folks who are dominated and oppressed so that it turns them against each other rather than helping us to recognize the ways in which whiteness is a choice that is poisoning us? I think there are many examples of coalitions between minoritized people. In my own subfield of New Testament and early Christianity, I think of the recently co-authored work by Mitzi Smith and Young Suk Kim on decentering the New Testament. We can look bigger to the political realm of the US and think about something like Love-Driven Politics Collective that David Kuman Kim has started. We can think of the wonderful She the People, in which women of color are brought together as political leaders together in unity, or if in disagreement, at least in productive debate in this country. I think within Yale Divinity School of my colleague Jan Lin's work on reading the Apocalypse of John in relation to multiple forms of racism and immigration. So I think that that ability to ask the question of what white supremacy does in our mind, that ability to call to mind, Assata Shakur said, it is our duty to fight for our freedom, right? How do we create coalitions? Coalitions driven by love, by the casting off of chains, to kind of echo Assata Shakur's words. How do we do that together instead of listening to that dominant and oppressive voice that would fracture us from each other?
All right, thank you. So, Anthea, this is a question that's not all that dissimilar to the previous two. But the question is it feasible to be apolitical over the matters that we're currently debating? And do we create greater confusion by being political? And would we create greater clarity if we were not political? So this is kind of up your alley with commenting on religion and politics. So there it is.
Absolutely. Jesus was political. He turned over the tables in the temple. So I'll start there. Jesus was political. And Jesus was somebody who turned over the tables in the temple. He spoke against the Roman Empire. He scared them. And so my statement is, first and foremost, everything is political. You can't get away from it. And secondarily, when we have some Christians in this country who make everything political and have decided that they want to align in certain kinds of political ways, then I think we can't deal without the issue of race without making it be political. Political has to be part of this because basically, how did you get anything? How did the Reverend Martin Luther King walk in the streets and challenge the status quo of this country of Jim Crow? I think this is one of the things, and I'm going to call this out just the way I see it because I've been working on this for a while. Many Christians, especially evangelical Christians, would like to not have to deal with racism as a structural issue. They would like to deal with it as an issue of sin. And in your heart, well, yes, it's sin, but you can have individual sin and structural sin. And racism is a sin in both areas. And I think that if we continue to try to do this kind of la-di-da thing where we don't need to make this political, we just need to deal with our neighbors better. And we need to be kind to each other. I'm sorry, we're past that. The time for that is long gone, because nothing in this country works if we just put it on the basis of being nice. I'd love to just be nice about this. I would love to not have to think about this in a political fashion. But, you know, it's not even enough to vote anymore. You're going to have to go out and like be active about what you want to see change. And so when I hear these kinds of questions about, you know, whether or not we should be political and is it too much for Christians, I say if Jesus could do it, why can't you?
All right, thank you.
Can I say something quickly in regard to
Sure.
that? I love that so often we're coming back to Jesus, since this is kind of my field, something I'm deeply concerned about. I absolutely agree that we need to read Jesus. You know, in the words of Dr. Mitri Rahab as a Palestinian Jew, in the words of James Cone as looking at the cross and the lynching tree, in the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, the loveliest lynchie was our Lord. That is absolutely central. But we also name that as, for those of us who are Christians, as central to our identity at the same time as we recognize the complicity of Christianity with various forms of settler colonialism. And as we recognize that we have to take responsibility for how we read and how we interpret these texts, which parts of them we lift up as liberative and which parts of them we need to recognize the histories of hermeneutics, the histories of interpretation that have been so damaging to so many people.
Yeah. And if I could just add one thing to what Laura just said and to what Anthea just said, one of the great challenges we're facing is that for so many Christians, especially so many white Christians, inside of this, they imagine that their Christianity is being attacked while we're challenging whiteness. And part of the challenge is to help people see a different narration of their own faith, one in which whiteness and Christianity are not joined together, and that their Christianity is really foreign to them. It is a call to a different reality of life than the one they have been shaped by in this country. It's one of the great problems of the American narrative, is that the American narrative has been so deeply and closely aligned with a fabricated Christian narrative that for some people listening to us, you know, those who are working with people who have been shaped in that fabricated narrative, their defensiveness is going to be a real challenge because they hear what's actually not being said. That is to say, they hear a destruction of faith, when in fact what's being said is that there is a faith yet to be touched, yet to be held, yet to be inhabited, that puts them on a different side of history, especially American history. For some people, they've never gotten the memo that this is not God's country.
Well, let me come to the last question from the viewers. And Harry, I'm going to give this to you as someone who led the Divinity School for 10 years and has been a part of it for much longer. And that is, what does YDS do to address the racism in its own halls? And I will promise the students we will address this much more fully at a future time, but I don't want to give us a path on this within this context.
Right. I think the first thing I want to say is, in some ways, picking up on the conversation that we've already had, because one of the things that we do here is to teach the traditional biblical texts, the New Testament, and to think about their implications. And Laura has made the very valid point that we need to think critically about how those texts have been used and deployed in various ways to support social structures that are not particularly like the kingdom of God. Nonetheless, and I think Anthea's point that Jesus was a radical who got himself in some difficulty because of taking a public action against the economic and religious structures of his day is something we need to keep in mind. I think one of the things that we need to help people with is to look at the words of Jesus and to look at the experience that we find in the New Testament. Some of the questions that have been on the table in the last few minutes have been about the relationship between religion and politics. And there's been an anxiety on the part of some people who are posing these questions, I think, that those of us who are addressing these issues are selling out our religious tradition in favor of a simple political solution. And I think in part that needs to be challenged on the basis of reading some simple texts. When the Beatitudes say, "Blessed are those who thirst after blank," what do you fill in? Is it a righteousness that's just the righteousness of the individual heart, given by grace from God above, or is it justice? And the word is justice, as one of our former colleagues here has taught us on numerous occasions. And that kind of justice manifests itself not in the interiority of a relationship with God, but in the kinds of things that Jesus says to the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, giving homes to those who don't have them, etc. So I think we need to have that in mind when we think about our relationship to God and what our responsibilities are. And I think that needs to be part of what we're teaching at the Divinity School. Not that that's new. I think we've been teaching it for a good long time. And I think the current situation that we're confronting asks us to think more deeply, more radically, more consistently about how that gospel message relates to the kinds of things that are going on in our society. I think we've done a decent job in recent years. Greg, you could take a lot of credit for that, for increasing the diversity in our faculty. We need to continue to make sure that that remains the case, that we have a representative and encompassing faculty, Black, white, Asian, who knows what. There's probably more that can be brought to the table. We need to see the ways in which what we're talking about on a regular basis impacts and has a relationship to the kinds of social and structural issues that we've said underlie the racism in America. So the occasional gesture toward that is not enough. We need to address that as part of our curriculum and co-curricular activities. I think we already do that to some extent, but there are, I think, new and creative ways in which we could pursue that further. And so, there are probably attitudes and assumptions that we make, like the attitudes and assumptions that we've called into question here today, that we need to take into account at YDS, but that's true of all of us. And I think we need to continue that process of coming to awareness of who we are and what we assume. We have work to do, but it's work that stands in a tradition that has been doing that work, and I think we need to celebrate that too.
I just want to echo some of what Harry is saying, and I also want to pick up on Willie's term imagination that he used earlier, and Willie used it to, I think, Willie, if I'm right, you were talking about the kind of limited, constrained, and even evil imagination of the ways in which our city organizations can create deserts for hospitals or food for communities of color. And I always think about our universities and our churches, our mosques, our synagogues, our institutions for religious practice as places for a quasi-utopian imagination, where we have this ability to create laboratories and experiments. We can look at history as an archive of possibility, as well as look critically at history for a real laboratory of ways in which domination has worked, so that we can route it in the present. And I am just thrilled about the ways in which we can transform in our hiring and in our admissions to create a more diverse community. But I really want to agree that that is not enough, that the transformation that needs to happen in the university has to happen at the level of pedagogy. We need to be thinking about our classroom spaces and the spaces in which our students interact when we're not with them as sites for transformation, instead of as sites for the industry of education. Second, to think about our syllabi. You know, I hear from students that they're reading a double syllabus, that they have to go and read their own stuff and then read what we prioritize in the classroom. So how can we change our syllabi to really make them focused on anti-Blackness for those of us who deal with various historical time periods, as well as for those of us who teach to normative issues? And third, how can we transform our research? So I think about the ways in which Fred Moten and Stefano Harney talk about the undercommons, the ways in which universities produce these kind of subterranean spaces of fugitivity in which the really interesting imaginative work happens and the coalitions happen. How can we make space so that our scholars are allowed to produce the full range of imaginative work that really functions to rout anti-Blackness, to challenge racism, that they can do that work as part of their acknowledged university service and their acknowledged intellectual labor in the university, that research is seen as really urgent to the mission of producing new kinds of knowledge in the university. So that's what I'm hoping for Yale.
Okay, thank you. If students are listening, and I hope some are, there will be at least 11 courses this fall that will deal with the issue of race in very direct and substantive ways. So you can look for those. Last question is, let me start with a quote from Samuel Beckett, who wrote, "Ever try, ever fail, no matter, try again, fail again, fail better." Sometimes I think that's what we've been trying to do for over 150 years in terms of race relations, is I hope we're failing better, but we're clearly still failing. So the question is this, in two parts: what steps would you like to see taken immediately? And can you help people think about a realistic time frame in which this problem is going to be addressed? And I don't think the question is intended to say, if it can't be solved overnight, then why are we doing all this? I don't think it's not that kind of a question. That's not where people were coming from. But just realistically, what's the time frame that we need to have in our mind? So in order of how you appear on my screen right now, Willie, I see you first.
Well, and Greg, thank you again for this panel. And it was great to be with my colleagues here. You know, let's start with this question of a timeline and what's realistic. You know, here we want to think about the temple a little differently, Greg. We are in a country that has resisted the truth almost from the beginning. And so, you know, we have to think about the temple in terms of that resistance. And so what I hope is that this is a moment where almost immediately we can begin to dismantle the level of resistance to seeing the truth. I mean, this is crucial here. I mean, I think rather than focusing on the things that have been done with the civil rights movement and before that, many heroic and wonderful things have been done. All that's true. We don't want to negate that. But I think we want to focus in on the stubborn resistance to seeing, learning, and accepting. That's the crucial work that I think can be done now. And I think to think about it temporally, you know, immediately, immediately now, maybe for the first time in history, as I was saying earlier, we can get people of European descent who've been in this country for hundreds of years now. Their families have been here for hundreds of years. Now, for the first time, to move away from the practices that constitute a cultivated ignorance of, I don't know, I don't want to know, and if I do know, I'm going to deny that I know. to move into a deep moment of decision to learn, to live in the knowledge, and to act as though you know, right? And I think that's going to be crucial, because the trying again, the efforts will always be thwarted by an abiding practice of ignorance, an abiding practice of escape and concealment and segregation, in which whiteness can continue to be a cultivated and cultivating practice for so many people. So I think this is the thing that we are at the cusp of an opportunity, especially for the young people who will say, I don't want to play the game of pretending not to know, and of living my life in the comfort of not knowing, and functioning as though that all that this comes down to are individual choices and individual responsibilities, as Anthea said earlier. So that I think what we want to recognize is that this is a moment where the trying again and the failing and then trying again now has to be calibrated to the truth of living in the knowledge. And then, and I do want to say, I think what's really crucial here is that we need to enter fully into local projects of changing the way things are. And I think this is what Lawrence was saying earlier, the local utopian projects, if you will, of trying to change the way things are. As a theologian, here's what we understand. The world was created out of nothing, which in Christian thought means that the world has no inherent permanence, no inherent stability. Nothing that is has to be the way it is. And as a Christian, we must be disciplined by the fact that instability, that fundamental instability, is also an opportunity to change. Nothing has to be the way it is. Nothing has to stay the way it is. And to believe that something is permanent other than God is already idolatry.
Thank you. Very well said, Willie. Laura, what would you say?
I want to pick up in this concluding comment on what Willie just said. I want to emphasize the word practice that he just used. I want to think about the ways in which it's really important for us to think about the discipline of anti-racism, the discipline of confronting anti-Blackness every day. For myself, I think about that in my own household. What do I talk with my children about? I think about it in terms of the classroom. In whatever form we appear in the fall, what are the ways in which, on a regular basis, even if I'm studying some obscure inscription with my students from the ancient world, how do we foreground these issues of power and domination? What is the ascesis? That's the Greek word for discipline, but it reminds us of asceticism, the practice of the athlete, the practice of the religious person, the monk or the nun who constantly disciplines him or herself. You asked about timelines too. I think about the ways in which early Christian texts often imagine the reign of God or the kingdom of God, right? That relationality of people as they follow worship, how they imagine that as something that's happening already and not yet, right? If we thought it always was already, then we would be vain. We would not be able to critique ourselves. I think about the words of the poet Kay Ryan, who's talking about rabbinical tradition. And she talks about the rabbinical tradition imagining the kingdom of peace, and in her words, as an incremental resurrection. So what are the ways in which daily in our academic work or in our own lives can our anti-racist practices be that incremental resurrection that's always on the horizon, something we're working towards, but we know we haven't yet perfected it. That the task of work, of dispelling that fog of ignorance, to pick up Willie's words again, is always our responsibility day by day.
Thank you. No, I just say amen to what both of you have said. Harry, you have last thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not a very good prophet, so I don't know how long it's going to take to eliminate racism. The one of the earlier comments, I think in one of your quotes, Greg, was about racism as one of the original sins, or the original sin of our society in North America. And an original sin, I think, is a very difficult thing to eliminate. So it's probably going to be with us for a while. I think some of the things that we've already put on the table about raising our own awareness, raising the awareness of our immediate community at the Divinity School, working with friends and colleagues throughout the university to see how we can contribute to addressing the structural issues in our immediate and larger societies. These are all things that we need to be working on. Implementing some of the things that we've talked about increasing responsibility and oversight of police to address the issue of police brutality, of thinking about ways in which resources can be channeled to minority communities in order to alleviate the difficulties of inadequate housing and educational systems that don't work. There are political and social solutions to some of these things, and they're going to take a while to implement. But I think we need to be engaged and continue to work on them. And hopefully, within a generation or two, we'll have made some significant progress. But I think that original sin is going to be around working its negative impacts for some time to come.
Yeah, that was Jim Wallace's phrase about slavery, which has become justly famous. Thank you. Anthea, we give you the final word.
Well, I was thinking about the phrase, and you talked about fail. And I think we can't afford to fail this time. It's not just about, dealing with racism. It's about the soul of this nation. Right now, we sit at the edge of a precipice. We have a virus that is decimated over 100,000 people in this country. Over 2 million people have it, right? So there's number one. Number two is we have people in the streets protesting against the unjust violence. We have kids on the border who are in cages and not being able to go, or being deported without their parents. We have so many things in this country right now that are facing us, and a lot of them have to do with racism. Most of them actually have to do with racism. And so while you were asking the question, I was thinking about a song from the 60s by Buffalo Springfield, and part of the lyrics is, there's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Everybody look at what's going down here. We have young people in the street, Black, white, every race, everybody is in the street. And what has cheered me up this time, despite my depression about all of this, is that this is not just Black people in the street anymore. It's everybody, because we realize that this is a moment. This is in the midst of a pandemic, that people are willing to go out and be in the street and get a viral load because they are sick and tired of being sick and tired of what is going on in this country. We have to stop and pay attention. How long is it going to take? It might take another 400 years. It took us a long time to get to this bad space. But what I do know is this: if some things don't start to change immediately, we will fall off that precipice and we're not coming back. Whatever people think about this country, whether you think about it like a Christian nationalist, that this is what God ordained, America has a special place, or if you think that America is just another country like everybody else, we can all probably agree on the fact that if we don't deal with our racial problem, we will fail as a nation. We're not that old. The Roman Empire fell. We can fall too.
All right, thank you. I want to say a very special thank you to all four of you. This is an incredibly sensitive topic. It's where we live. It's Some of us have suffered under it. Some of us have been benefited from the structures. I think we all realize things do have to change. And I'm grateful for your time to help us, to provoke us to thinking about ways to make them change. And I hope that the viewers are as grateful as I am to have heard what you've had to say. And I hope that the kinds of exchanges that have happened among you, and I include myself too, will happen in many places, and that we can own our history. I will just add, I feel like slavery and the legacy is a dead albatross hanging around our necks, and it stinks to the high heavens, and we
Amen.
haven't been able to get it off. And it's time to take it off our necks and to address it.
Amen.
So
Amen.
I hope that this will help us move towards that. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.